The sun rose slowly over the snowy ridges of the Bighorn Mountains, casting a golden haze across the quiet Wyoming valley. Time seemed to move differently here. Mornings didn't rush. They rolled in gently, like mist over the hills. And at the edge of one gravel road, tucked behind a grove of wind-worn cottonwoods, stood a weathered farmhouse with green shutters and a sagging porch swing that still creaked in the wind. Walter Benson sat on that porch every morning without fail, come snow, sun, or silence. At 78, his frame had grown thinner, but there remained a tallness in how he carried himself, like a man who used to stand at blackboards and teach the world to listen. His flannel shirt was always buttoned to the top, suspenders over faded denim, and his old felt hat, now more gray than brown, rarely left his head. His eyes, once sharp and commanding in the classroom, had grown clouded with time. They wandered now, not always sure where they were meant to land. But every so often, they lit up, just a flicker, when something stirred a memory. A breeze carrying a scent of lilacs. The sound of a school bell from decades ago. Or most often, the image of a golden-furred dog running through the field. Rusty. The name came to him like clockwork. Not every name did, but that one never left. Rusty had been more than a pet. More than a companion. Rusty had been the last piece of Walter's world that still felt whole. Inside the house, dust collected on photographs no one had dusted in weeks. Pictures of Maggie, his daughter, and Lucy, his granddaughter, hung slightly crooked on the hallway wall. But Walter's gaze always skipped past them, as though his eyes couldn't hold onto faces anymore. He spent most days in that chair on the porch, his cane resting across his lap, watching the wind rustle through the empty field beyond the fence. Sometimes, he'd speak softly to no one in particular. Rusty liked that tree, he murmured once, pointing to the tall pine by the barn. Used to chase squirrels till his legs gave out. No one corrected him. Not anymore. In town, people spoke of Walter with a kind of reverence laced with sorrow. Smartest man I ever knew, the barber would say. Shame about his memory. They didn't see the flickers, the sparks. They only saw the fading. But Lucy saw more. Every Friday afternoon, Maggie would drive Lucy out to the farmhouse. The little girl, 8 years old with wild curls and a notebook tucked under her arm, would jump from the car and run to the porch like it was a castle. "Hi, Grandpa," she'd call, her voice as bright as the morning sun. And Walter, even if he didn't always remember her name, would smile. He always smiled. Because even when names slipped away and time folded in on itself, some things remained. The warmth of a little voice. The scent of pine in the wind. And the ghost of a golden dog resting gently at his feet. Every weekend, like clockwork, Lucy Benson arrived at her grandfather's house with a notebook full of ideas and a heart full of purpose. To her, Grandpa Walter wasn't just an old man in a rocking chair, he was a castle of stories, a mountain of mystery. Even if some days he didn't remember which day it was, or even what room he was in, Lucy believed that deep down, the best parts of him were still there. She just had to find them. She always began their visits the same way. Pulling out her notebook, frayed at the corners, covered in stickers of dogs, stars, and one oddly placed slice of pizza, she'd flip to a blank page and say, "Grandpa, do you remember Rusty today?" Sometimes he would nod slowly, his brows knitting together as if pulling something from the fog. "He had golden fur, right?" he'd ask, squinting into the yard. "Golden like sunshine," Lucy would whisper. And with that, they'd begin. She would make up stories. Wonderful, wild stories about Rusty saving the mailman from a bear, or sneaking into school dressed in Grandpa's old coat. She'd act them out sometimes, barking softly, crawling on all fours, her laughter echoing through the quiet house. And Grandpa, sitting in his chair, would chuckle. Sometimes belly laugh. Sometimes, tears would shine faintly in his eyes. Rusty was smarter than most folks, Walter would say. He'd listen better too. Lucy noticed something. The more she talked about Rusty, the more Grandpa came back to her. Not always, not completely, but enough. Once, while she was coloring in a picture of Rusty digging up treasure in the backyard, Grandpa reached out slowly and touched the page. His fingers were weathered, trembling slightly. "He did that once," Walter said softly. "Buried your grandma's best shoes. Took me days to find him." Lucy looked up, surprised. It wasn't one of her made-up tales. It was real. He was remembering. Later that afternoon, she ran to the old hallway closet and dug through the boxes until she found a pair of shoes, scuffed, with one still stained faintly with mud. She brought them back like they were relics. Grandpa laughed when he saw them, a sound that seemed to shake the dust off the walls. "You're a smart little fox," he said to Lucy. Like Rusty was. That was the first time in weeks he called her by name. Maggie watched from the kitchen, one hand pressed to her lips, tears welling quietly. She hadn't seen that side of her father in too long. To Lucy, it didn't feel like therapy or work. It felt like love. A secret way back to someone she knew was still inside. And if stories were the bridge, she was going to build it, one paw print at a time. Every weekend, she'd come back with new tales, new drawings, and new hope. Because somewhere behind the fog of forgetfulness, Rusty still lived. And with him, so did Grandpa. The days passed in a quiet rhythm, but inside Walter Benson's mind, the rhythm was often broken. Like a song with missing notes. Some mornings, he'd wake in the small bedroom he'd slept in for nearly 50 years and not know where he was. He'd sit on the edge of the bed, hands clasped together, eyes scanning the room as though it belonged to someone else. Sometimes he'd dress in 2 shirts or put his socks over his shoes. Maggie would gently help him fix it, never pointing out the mistake. He didn't need reminders of what he'd forgotten. The forgetting itself was reminder enough. One morning, as the light filtered through the thin curtains, Walter stood in the kitchen, staring into the open refrigerator. Maggie came in and smiled. "Looking for something, Dad?" Walter turned, holding a stick of butter in one hand, a jar of pickles in the other. "I thought I was feeding the chickens," he said, his brow furrowed. "Didn't we used to have chickens?" Maggie gently took the butter and set it aside. "A long time ago. When I was little." "Oh," he said, his voice quiet. "That's right. I forgot." His shoulders sagged, just a little. That kind of forgetting wasn't like misplacing car keys. It was like losing a piece of himself. Later that day, Lucy arrived with her usual energy. She skipped in, notebook under her arm, cheeks flushed pink from the wind. "Hi, Grandpa." Walter blinked, looked at her for a long time. "Maggie?" he asked. Lucy froze for a moment. "No, it's me, Lucy." He studied her again. Something flickered across his face. "Lucy. That's right. You're Maggie's little girl." Lucy nodded, a little smile playing on her lips. "And your best storytelling partner." Walter chuckled, though it sounded more like a sigh. "That's what I meant." But later, while Lucy played in the living room, Walter sat in his armchair staring at his own hands. They looked unfamiliar, spotted, veined, trembling. He turned them over like he was trying to remember who they used to belong to. When Maggie came in with tea, she found him still there, lost in thought. "I keep thinking I'm going to remember something important," he said softly. "But it's like chasing smoke." Maggie knelt beside him. "You don't have to chase anything, Dad. You're here. That's enough." He looked at her then. Really looked. For a second, the fog seemed to lift. "Did I love her well?" he asked. "Who?" "Your mother. Did I love her like I meant to?" Maggie's throat tightened. She placed her hand on his. "You did. Every day." Walter nodded slowly, staring into a memory only he could see. The hardest part wasn't forgetting, it was knowing he'd forgotten. The parts of him that felt solid once, teacher, husband, father, friend, were all still there. Somewhere. But they drifted like leaves in a breeze he couldn't control. And yet, in the middle of that drifting, one thing remained steady: the sound of a child's voice, a girl with messy curls and a heart full of light. Lucy. She anchored him, even on the days when he felt like a stranger in his own skin. It started with a drawing. One afternoon, Lucy sat cross-legged on the living room floor, crayons spread like confetti around her. Her small fingers moved with purpose across the page. A golden dog with floppy ears and a wagging tail stood proudly beside a man with a cane and a smile. Above them, she carefully printed the words, "Rusty and Grandpa stop a train." She held up the picture when it was done and ran to Walter's side. "Grandpa," she said, breathless with excitement, "do you remember when you and Rusty stopped the train from crashing into the apple cart?" Walter blinked, confused. I don't think I do." "That's okay," Lucy replied brightly. "I'll tell you the whole story." And she did. She spun a tale about how Rusty had sniffed out trouble down by the old train tracks, how Grandpa had followed him and found a broken signal, and how they'd waved down the engineer just in time to stop the train. Walter listened, quiet at first, then chuckling softly by the end. "Smart dog," he murmured, patting his knee where Rusty used to rest his head. "That sounds like something he would have done." Lucy grinned. "I've got more." Each visit, she brought a new story, fresh from her imagination but always tied to something real: a photo she found in a drawer, a name etched into the porch wood, or a memory Maggie had whispered to her in the car. There was the day Rusty rescued a baby deer from the creek. The time Grandpa and Rusty camped under the stars and Rusty chased a raccoon up a tree. The story where Rusty barked so loud he scared off a whole gang of raccoons robbing the kitchen. Lucy would narrate while Grandpa sat in his chair, sometimes laughing, sometimes lost in thought. And every so often, he'd chime in with a detail she hadn't known. He hated the vacuum, Walter once said, interrupting a story about Rusty and a ghost in the attic. Used to bark at it like it was a burglar. Really? Lucy's eyes widened. Every single time. From then on, the vacuum became Rusty's nemesis in nearly every story. Maggie started keeping a box in the corner of the living room, Rusty's Adventures, filled with Lucy's drawings, scribbled stories, and notes Grandpa muttered under his breath. Lucy said it was their book in progress. "He remembers more when we talk about Rusty," she told her mother one night. "It's like the stories help him find his way back." Maggie brushed a curl from Lucy's forehead. "You're doing something very special, sweetheart." "I'm not curing him," Lucy said with a small shrug. "But maybe I'm helping him remember how it felt to be loved." Because in her young heart, Lucy understood something most grown-ups missed. Memory isn't always found in facts. Sometimes it lives in feelings. And the stories we tell are how we keep the people we love from drifting too far away. The turning point came on a windy Saturday, when the clouds hung low and the air smelled like rain. Lucy had brought a new story, her most elaborate yet, Rusty and the Case of the Missing Pancakes. She'd drawn Grandpa in his slippers, standing beside an empty plate, while Rusty wore a detective hat and sniffed a trail of syrup across the kitchen floor. She giggled as she told it, acting out each clue Rusty discovered. Grandpa watched her from his armchair, his brow creased, lips slightly parted. Then, just as Lucy was describing Rusty finding the last pancake under the couch, Walter raised a hand. "No, no," he said, smiling gently. "It wasn't under the couch. It was in the mailbox." Lucy paused. "What?" Walter nodded, eyes twinkling. "I left my plate on the porch once, and Rusty snatched the pancake. Ran right down the driveway and dropped it into the mailbox. Took me 3 days to figure out where the ants were coming from." Lucy blinked, then burst out laughing. "You remember that?" "Clear as day," he said, a little amazed himself. From then on, something shifted. The stories no longer belonged to Lucy alone. Grandpa began offering details, some prompted, others uninvited. During a tale about Rusty and the snowstorm, he added, "He used to sleep by the wood stove, snoring louder than I did." When Lucy described a picnic by the lake, Walter leaned in and said, "We used to take him to Willow Pond. He'd dive in like a cannonball, chasing frogs." Maggie listened from the kitchen, tears welling in her eyes. These weren't just imagined moments, they were real memories, fragments of a life that Alzheimer's hadn't completely stolen. Some days, Walter still got lost in his own house. He confused Lucy with her mother or stared blankly at the calendar for minutes. But when he talked about Rusty, something in him steadied. His voice grew firmer. His eyes held clarity, if only for a little while. One afternoon, Lucy brought him a small wooden box she'd found in the attic. It was carved with initials, WB. Inside were yellowing photographs, a cracked leather collar, and a faded tennis ball worn down by years of chewing. Walter stared at the items, silent for a long moment. Then he picked up the collar, turning it slowly in his hands. "I bought this the day we brought him home," he said softly. "He was the runt. Nobody wanted him. But he ran straight to me." Lucy sat beside him, watching the past come alive in his eyes. "We were good for each other," Walter whispered. She placed her hand over his. "You still are." That night, Maggie added a new page to their growing scrapbook, a photo of Rusty as a pup, nestled in Walter's lap, both of them younger, both whole. They called it, "The Day Grandpa Remembered." And though they knew not every day would be like that, they also knew something precious. Even in a fading mind, love leaves footprints. And sometimes, all it takes is a story to find them. The sky was the color of pewter, and the wind rustled the dry grass with a sound like whispers. It was the kind of afternoon that invited quiet exploration, and Lucy, restless after lunch, wandered out to the old barn behind the house. She had been there before, many times, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the way the light slanted through the gaps in the weathered boards, or the smell of rain and hay mingling in the air. Dust swirled around her feet as she stepped inside. Cobwebs stretched across forgotten corners, and boxes were stacked high like ancient monuments to the past. She climbed carefully over a wooden beam that had fallen long ago and made her way toward a rusted shelf near the back wall. It was there, half buried beneath a pile of newspapers from the 1980s, that she found it, a small wooden box, its lid barely hanging on by a single hinge. She pulled it out gently, brushing off the dust. The box creaked open with a sigh. Inside was something that made her breath catch. A worn red collar, cracked with age, but still holding the shape of the neck it once circled. The name tag, rusted but legible, read, "Rusty." There was also a faded photograph folded beneath it, Grandpa Walter, 20 or 30 years younger, kneeling beside a bright-eyed golden retriever, both of them smiling into the camera. Lucy ran her fingers over the collar as if it were something sacred. It felt warm, even in the chilly air. She clutched the box to her chest and ran back to the house, her boots thudding across the earth. When she reached the porch, she called out, "Grandpa, look what I found." Walter turned from his chair, his eyes narrowing as she approached. She opened the box and held it out to him. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, with trembling hands, he reached for the collar. "I remember this," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I thought it was gone." Lucy smiled. "Not gone," she said gently. "Just waiting to be found again." Walter sat on the porch with the collar in his lap, his fingers tracing the edges of the leather like they were reading a story in Braille. Lucy sat beside him, legs swinging just above the porch steps, her gaze fixed not on the collar, but on his face. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant echo of crows. Walter closed his eyes. "I remember the day he died," he said quietly. Lucy looked up. "It was a cold morning," he continued, voice low and steady. "He hadn't been eating for days. I tried to carry him to the truck, to get to the vet, but halfway down the driveway, he stopped me." He opened his eyes, tears forming but not falling. "Rusty just sat there and leaned into me. Like he was saying, 'This is far enough.'" Lucy reached for his hand. "You stayed with him?" "I sat with him until the sun came up. He put his head in my lap, like he always did when he was a pup. And then, he was gone. Silence hung between them for a while, heavy but not cold. I never talked about it, Walter said, more to the wind than to Lucy. Felt like if I said it out loud, I'd lose it all. But you didn't, Lucy said softly. It's still here. She pointed to his heart, then to his head. Maybe not all the time. But enough. Walter looked at her, and for a moment, there was no confusion in his eyes, only warmth. You've been helping me remember, he said. I just told stories. They weren't just stories, he replied, his voice growing stronger. They were breadcrumbs. You left a trail for me, Lucy. I was lost, and you led me home. Lucy leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. That evening, Maggie stepped out onto the porch and saw the two of them sitting like that, hands intertwined, a faded red collar between them. Walter looked up and smiled. Do you remember when Rusty chased the school bus all the way to the stop sign? He asked. I do, Maggie whispered, her voice cracking. It wasn't a cure. The fog would return. But in that moment, they had sunlight. And stories. And each other. Sometimes, that was enough. The days that followed were quieter, but something had changed in the house. Not in a loud or obvious way, but like a window had been cracked open after a long winter, letting in light, letting in air. Walter still had his moments. There were mornings he couldn't remember what season it was or thought Lucy was a student waiting for her lesson. But there was also a softness to him now, a kind of peace that Maggie hadn't seen in years. It began with the scrapbook. Lucy started gluing her drawings and Grandpa's memories into a big leather-bound book. She called it Rusty's Tales and insisted on writing a short line beneath each picture in her careful, loopy handwriting. One page showed Rusty in a cape. Underneath it read, the time Rusty saved the laundry from flying into the creek. Another had a picture of Grandpa asleep in a chair, Rusty curled up beneath him. Rusty kept all the bad dreams away. Maggie added her own touches. A photo here. A date there. Bits of stories she remembered from her own childhood that Grandpa hadn't spoken of in years. The scrapbook became more than a book, it became a bridge. Some evenings, they would gather around the kitchen table, the three of them. Lucy would read aloud, Walter would nod and sometimes offer a correction, no, that happened in 78, not 79. They'd laugh, even cry. But more than anything, they were together. One night, Walter looked at Maggie across the table. I thought I'd lost everything, he said. But I see now, memory doesn't always live where we think it does. She didn't speak. She just reached across and took his hand. Lucy looked up from her drawing. It lives in us, Grandpa. Even if we forget sometimes. He smiled at her. You're smarter than I ever was. Nope, she said proudly. I just listened to good stories. The past hadn't been erased. It had just been waiting in the old photos, in the feel of a worn collar, in the heart of a child who refused to let go. And slowly, gently, the family healed. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. Together. Spring arrived quietly in Wyoming. The snow melted into the fields, and soft green began to return to the hills. Birds nested in the eaves of the barn again, and the wind carried the scent of lilacs through the open windows of the farmhouse. Life, as it always did, moved forward. Walter sat on the porch one morning, bundled in a thick cardigan, the scrapbook resting on his lap. He turned the pages slowly. Some names he couldn't recall, some faces had grown unfamiliar, but Rusty's eyes, drawn in crayon and ink, were always clear. That dog, he once said, had remembered him even on the days he forgot himself. Lucy joined him, holding a small golden retriever pup in her arms. The fur was lighter than Rusty's, the eyes brighter, but there was something in the tilt of the head, the trust in its gaze, that felt like an echo. His name's Sonny, Lucy said. He's not Rusty. But maybe he'll make new stories. Walter chuckled softly, the sound rasped but warm. I think Rusty would like that. Some days were good. Others were harder. Sometimes he called the puppy Rusty. Sometimes he asked Lucy where she lived. But the fear had lessened. In its place, there was love, woven into routines and rituals, breakfast at the table, stories from the scrapbook, a puppy at his feet. One afternoon, as the sun lowered over the mountains, Walter looked out across the field and said, "You know, I used to think memory was like a book you carried with you. But maybe it's more like music. You don't have to remember every note. Just the feeling of the song." Lucy nodded slowly. "And some songs," she whispered, "you never really forget." Later that evening, Maggie tucked the scrapbook onto a shelf beside the family Bible. She looked at her daughter, then at her father, and felt the weight of generations, the pain, the healing, the stories passed down. They had all changed. But in finding their way through memory and loss, they had discovered something lasting. That even when minds fade, love remains. And the stories we tell become the legacy we leave behind.